And well, in today's lesson it's part 2 of our lesson on chapter 10 of Animal Farm by George Orwell. In today's lesson we are looking at Allegory and Symbolism in chapter 10, which in all likelihood will run over and be at least 2 parts. I want to go quite slowly in quite a lot of detail through the allegory and some of the symbols that are really important in this scene. I'm going to start the lesson again by just reminding of the summary of the chapter, which of course you've already read by now. So the summary will appear on your screens momentarily, and then we'll go straight into the lesson and looking specifically at allegory and symbolism. And some of I'll be using the visualizer to show you some sections from the novel, but also just images and speaking over those images as we go. So let's have a look at that summary again. Before we start, it's worth reminding you of, in this chapter particularly, given it's our final chapter and it's the resolution of the novel, it's worth constantly trying to keep in the back of your minds thinking about what Orwell's purpose is in his use of symbolism and in his use of allegory, and ultimately what his political message is. And we'll come back to this at the end of the lesson, so we'll think about what his political message is to the reader, thinking about when it was written in 1945, yes, but also thinking about how this novel still relates and still resonates with modern day readers or contemporary readers. So we'll be thinking about that as we go along and as we look at the allegory. Okay, so last lesson we talked about the narrative structure, and we talked about how this chapter is framed initially by the use of temporal shifts, so the use of a flash forward. And I told you that it's about, it's kind of a jarring effect for the reader because we've empathized and sympathized and rooted for these animals the entire way through the novel, and now essentially because of the flash forward we see that all of their dreams have not, none of their dreams have come to fruition. They've all kind of been shattered. And I wanted to start by talking about the description of the pigs, particularly of Napoleon and Squealer at the beginning of the chapter. And just to remind you of the fact that this novel, as well as being, because it fits into so many genres, it fits into the dystopian genre, it fits into the parable genre, the fable genre, it's obviously an allegory, but it also is a biting and quite ferocious satire. And we've used this phrase a few times throughout this unit. A satire is a piece of literature that mocks and makes fun of its subjects, and the subject that Orwell is mocking is Stalinism and totalitarianism. And in this chapter, I think he does it it's quite subtle sometimes throughout the novel, but in this chapter, it's really obvious and explicit. So he uses the weight of the pigs, the fact that they are now fat, the fact that Napoleon is now a mature boar of 24 stone, which is pretty whopping. That's used by Orwell really obviously to make fun of the, I suppose, Stalin and his inner circle, but also it's an obvious kind of satirical image that makes fun of their gluttony, their greed, and their corruption. It's really ironic, of course, that as the other animals are starving and underfed, the pigs have become increasingly fat and overweight as the novel progressed, and their weight is a very obvious caricature. It's clearly a satire of the fact that they are corrupt and they're hypocritical. Okay, so that's why I want to start off with the weight of the pigs and how they're described. Okay, the second part of the allegory I'd like to speak about is the description of the farm in chapter 10, and I'm just going to read it very quickly. It's on page 93, the second paragraph. The farm was more prosperous now and better organised. It had even been enlarged by 2 fields which had been bought from Mr. Pilkington. The windmill had been successfully completed at last, and the farm possessed a threshing machine and a hay elevator of its own, and various new buildings had been added to it. Wimper had bought himself a dog cart. The windmill, however, had not after all been used for generating electrical power. It was used for milling corn and brought in a handsome money profit. The animals were hard at work building yet another windmill. When that one was finished, so it was said, the dynamos would be installed. But the luxuries of which Snowball had once taught the animals to dream, the stalls with electric light and hot water and cold water, and the 3-day week were no longer talked about. Napoleon had denounced such ideas as contrary to the spirit of animalism. The truest happiness, he said, lay in working hard and living frugally. Somehow it seemed as though the farm had grown richer without making the animals themselves any richer, except, of course, for the pigs and the dogs. Okay, so this is really important. The windmill has been, I've talked about this a lot, it's an allegory for the 5-year plans that Stalin implemented, but it's also a symbol of hope and progress at some points in the novel. It then becomes a symbol with a different meaning. And at the end of the novel, it still symbolises, I would argue, the betrayal of the animals. The fact that they put so much hard work and sweat and blood and tears into building the windmill, but none of them actually benefits from what the windmill produces. You'll notice that it describes the fact that they actually use it for milling corn and then they sell the corn to make money. This is really important. So on an allegorical level, there's actually a lot going on in that one passage. Let's start with the description of the farm being more prosperous now. This is an allegory of essentially the development and progress of the Soviet Union and it becoming a wealthier nation. And again, remember, it started at a fairly low point, but Stalin's 5-year plans and his collectivization did manage to modernize and to industrialize Russia. So that's what's happened to the farm. It's now wealthier, it's better organized. However, you'll also notice that, there's a very important significance to this. You'll notice that the fields have been bought from Mr. Pilkington. That's how the farm has gotten bigger. And this is an allegory for what's coming on your screens now. Okay, so this is a map of Europe during the Cold War, which kind of began towards the end of the Second World War and ran all the way up into the beginning of the 1990s. The blue countries are known as the West, I think this is the wrong way around, as the Western Bloc, and the red countries are supposed to be the Eastern Bloc. I think this is the wrong way around. The white strip that runs through between these countries is known as the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain, a phrase from a famous Winston Churchill speech. What you'll notice if you look at the Soviet Union is that essentially it's gotten bigger. It's incorporated countries like Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. So this reflects the territory that the Russians gained at the end of the Second World War. So the allegory here of Animal Farm growing bigger is actually it actually is an allegory of how the Russian state and I suppose the Soviet state and the Soviet nation grew after World War II because of the territory that they were given by the West. And we know that Mr. Pilkington is an allegory for Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. Okay, so that's the allegory of the farm getting bigger. And this links to my next point, which is that the farm has clearly become innovative and technological. They have threshing machines, they have hay elevators, they have a windmill now. So it reflects what happened to Russia essentially at the end of the Second World War, by which time they were essentially a superpower and a superpower with nuclear capabilities. So this is kind of what sparks the Cold War, the tensions between the East and West. But by the end of the Second World War, Russia had industrialized to the point where it was considered to be a superpower. And as you can see, the farm is described as a superpower of sorts. So therefore, the windmill becomes an allegorical representation of Russia being a superpower, or the Soviet Union becoming a growing power in the world. But what's really important, and some of us may not have noticed this, is that this has come at the cost of the pigs having betrayed the values of animalism. The windmill is not is not used to make the animals' lives any better. It's used to mill corn, which is sold for a profit, which is of course something that a capitalist would do. So if we go back to all the way back to our opening lesson on the introduction to Animal Farm, and I talked about the differences between capitalism and communism. Essentially, in a capitalist society, your means of production, your factory, would be owned by a capitalist who would use the factory to make a profit, and he would use some of the profit to pay his wages, but he'd keep a lot of the profits. In a communist society, the idea would be that the workers would own the windmill. And in Animal Farm, this is essentially the farm has become a capitalist country, just not in name, because the pigs are now the capitalists, the windmill has become the means of production, and they're using the windmill to make money. So therefore the animals on the farm are the labourers. So essentially Animal Farm has become capitalist in name, in all but name only, okay? And that's why the windmill becomes a symbol of hypocrisy by the end of the novel. Because it doesn't fulfill any of the wishes that they'd had, or any of the dreams that they'd had. Okay, I think it's time for a checkpoint. Okay, so here are your checkpoint questions. Please make sure you answer in full sentences. Take your time, and obviously if you need more time than the 10 minutes I've given you, feel free to take it. And I'll see you shortly. Please now pause the video. Welcome back. What I'd like to talk about next is the allegorical and symbolic significance of what life is like on the farm at this point in the novel. First, I'd like to talk about the pigs. And the pigs have essentially created a system in which they do not take part in the manual labour of building the windmill, of building the new technology on the farm. But what they are described as doing by Orwell is things called files, reports, minutes and memoranda. And essentially this is an allegory. The fact that the pigs complete essentially pointless paperwork as their main job and do not provide anything in terms of food or anything tangible for the animals reflects how under Stalin the Soviet Union became a massive, what's called a bureaucracy, which is a kind of system of government which was far more concerned with paperwork and figures than with actually intervening in people's lives. And this is a kind of, again, an example of satire. Orwell is satirizing the bureaucracy of Stalinism and of communist Russia. Remember that a communist country has what's called a central planner. So rather than allowing people to have rather than having freedom to buy and sell what you want, the government would centrally plan. So they would allocate you your, let's say, your weekly shopping rather than you going out and buying what you actually want to buy. That's what a central plan is. And he's making fun of that as being an inefficient system which essentially ends up in being bureaucratic. And essentially the pigs are really getting away with doing very little work at all. So the pigs aren't doing very much work, and then it's the animals are later described, and I think it's really poignant in how they're described here. I'll read it out. This is from page 94. They were generally hungry, they slept on straw, they drank from the pool, they laboured in the fields. In winter they were troubled by the cold, and in summer by the flies. And what you'll notice, and we talked about this a lot in last lesson, that we talked about the cyclical narrative. Essentially, the life and lifestyle of the animals has returned to what it was like in chapter 1, and possibly even worsened. And this is again an allegory for how in Stalinist Russia, the vast majority of people, or of the Russian people, did not see the benefits, either economically or politically, of the Russian Revolution once Stalin became the leader. So it's an allegory of how the Russian people suffered under Tsar Nicholas II and suffered even more under Stalin. That's essentially the meaning of that allegory. And what Orwell's very concerned with in this chapter is memory, and the fact that the animals are forgetting what happened in 1917, and the fact that they're forgetting what happened in the revolution, again, is an allegory for how essentially the Russian people got used to life under Stalin and could not remember what life under the Tsar was like. And there's a description of the pride that they still have in their farm on page 95. The fact that they still have these symbols of nationalism, such as a gun booming and a green flag flying. And they still have these processions, and I'll show you a procession on your screen now. So on your screen you have an image of a military parade in the Red Square, which is the equivalent of Westminster in Moscow in 1945. The fact that the pigs insist on having these parades and these shows of nationalism and these shows of strength, this is very much linking to the theme in the novel of appearances and reality. And throughout the novel, the pigs have been masters at hiding and masking the horrors taking place on Animal Farm. This is an allegory for how Stalin and the Soviet states managed to hide the true reality, the true horrors of Stalinist Russia from the rest of the world. Remember that when Orwell's writing, we've talked about this a lot of times, Stalin is regarded in many Western countries as being a hero, and lots of people, including intellectuals, respect and admire the accomplishments of the communists in Russia. So that's the allegory there. It's about how these parades are used to show a false face to the world, to show a mask to the world. And it's deeply ironic that the animals feel pride when they see the gun booming, or they hear the gun booming. They see the green flag waving, and they hear about the idea that they're the only farm that's owned and operated by animals. It's ironic because, of course, Animal Farm is no longer really a communist state. It's become a dystopia. It's become a totalitarian society. So the fact that the animals feel pride at all is quite ironic. Okay, and of course the most important and kind of bizarre event, I suppose, of chapter 10, besides from the ending, is the scene in which the pigs start to walk on their hind legs, and they've been trained for weeks to do this. This is a deeply symbolic moment, and it does form part of our allegory. It's important in the structure of the novel as well, but let's focus on the symbolism. The fact that the animals, it's fairly obvious. It's a bit like the description of Napoleon and Squealer as being incredibly fat. The obvious symbolism here is that the pigs have become human beings. They've metamorphosized into human beings, very much like Farmer Jones. So the image of this procession of pigs walking on their hind legs, it symbolically represents how the pigs have essentially become Farmer Jones. They've gone full circle, and they see themselves as being superior to the other animals. Of course, all other animals are four-legged, and the fact that the pigs choose to stand on two represents their superiority and their rank in the hierarchy. They're of course the elite now in this hierarchy, which we looked at last lesson, that pyramid system. It's even more symbolic that Napoleon is also seen standing upright, and he's still surrounded by dogs. We talked about how that is obviously a reference to Stalin and Stalin's dictatorship and his totalitarian states that he successfully created. And what's important is the fact that with the description of Napoleon, which I'll show you now, Napoleon is described as carrying or holding a whip in his trotter. And of course the whip earlier in the novel was a symbol of oppression. Of course the whip was used by Jones, and he whipped the animals because he treated them like slaves. And the fact that Napoleon is now bearing that symbol of oppression and that symbol of tyranny suggests that he has now become the slave master, the slave driver. He is now the master of the farm. He is now the tyrant figure, and it's important that that symbol of the whip becomes a symbol of betrayal again, and a symbol of corruption. And it's interesting to just thinking before we move on to the next aspects of the allegory. The animals' reaction to what they see is one of terror, and they haven't felt as terrified as this since the massacre that took place in chapter 7. And let's remember why this is so terrifying. The pigs walking on their hind legs is clearly a breach of animalism, and of course animalism is the philosophy passed down by old Major, and it would be terrifying for the other animals to see the pigs so obviously break the rules. And once again, as you can see on your screens, the sheep are used in the story to change the they've changed their maxim from 4 legs good, 2 legs bad to 4 legs good, 2 legs better. And again, this is an allegory for how Stalin used the uneducated working classes to essentially used them to spread misinformation, but also manipulated them into believing anything that he said. So that it's about the ignorance and the exploitation of the uneducated working class. Okay, we're going to take another checkpoint. Your questions are on the screen. I've given you more time than usual because I know there's quite a few questions and they require a lot of thought. Please now make sure you're writing in full sentences. Make sure if you need more time, then please take it. So pause the video and I'll see you shortly. Welcome back. That is the end of part 2 of our video tutorial on chapter 10, the allegory and the symbolism used by Orwell. In the next lesson we'll be continuing our exploration of Orwell's use of allegory and symbolism in chapter 10, and I look forward to seeing you then. Stay safe and stay well, and goodbye.